It was February 24th, 1986, a bright Los Angeles morning that began like any other. The streets hummed with the soft buzz of traffic, the sun filtering through palm trees, and the smell of coffee drifting from nearby cafes. But inside a quiet condo on Balboa Boulevard, a nightmare was unfolding. When police arrived at the scene, the living room looked like chaos. Furniture was overturned, glass shattered, drawers yanked open, and on the floor lay a woman, her body bruised, her robe torn, and 3 bullets lodged deep in her chest. Her name was Sherri Rasmussen. She was just 29 years old, young, successful, and newly married. Her husband, John Rutten, had left for work early that morning. He came home to find the front door ajar, shards of broken glass scattered across the floor, and the silence of death waiting inside. To the detectives who responded, it seemed simple at first glance. A robbery gone wrong. The couple's VCR was missing, along with a few other electronics. A struggle appeared to have taken place. But there were cracks in the story, and buried in those cracks was a truth so shocking it would take more than 2 decades to surface. Because this wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't about theft or exploitation. This was a killing driven by obsession, jealousy, and revenge. And the killer wasn't a stranger. She was one of their own, a Los Angeles police officer. Sherri Rasmussen was known for her warmth, intelligence, and relentless drive. Born in 1957, she grew up in Loma Linda, California, in a close-knit family that valued kindness and hard work. Her father, Nels, and her mother, Loretta, adored her. They described her as a bright light, a young woman whose smile could soften even the hardest day. Sherri had always been gifted. She skipped grades, graduated early, and by her mid-20s, was already serving as the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Her colleagues respected her deeply, not just for her professionalism, but for her compassion. She was the kind of person who stayed late to comfort a grieving family, who made sure patients were treated like human beings, not hospital cases. She had built a life based on empathy and excellence. In 1985, Sherri married the love of her life, a soft-spoken engineer named John Rutten. They had met years earlier at UCLA, where John was popular, athletic, and handsome. Their relationship was the kind that looked perfect from the outside. 2 smart, successful young people building a future together. But in the background, someone else was watching. Someone who couldn't let go. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. Stephanie and John had dated briefly in college. Their relationship had been casual at first, jogging together, going to parties, spending time between classes. But for Stephanie, it had been something more. She'd fallen deeply for John, and even after they drifted apart, she stayed in his life. She joined the Los Angeles Police Department soon after graduation, a confident, athletic young woman who quickly earned a reputation for her enthusiasm and ambition. To her friends, she was lively, charming, and funny. But there was another side, one that emerged when she didn't get what she wanted. When John began dating Sherri, Stephanie's jealousy grew. She showed up uninvited to John's apartment. She brought him gifts. Once, she even went to his office with tears in her eyes, saying she couldn't accept that he was marrying someone else. According to Sherri's father, Stephanie had confronted Sherri directly, telling her that if she couldn't have John, nobody could. Sherri was unsettled. She told her parents that this woman, this police officer, made her feel unsafe. She even warned John, but he brushed it off as harmless. He thought Stephanie would eventually move on. But she didn't. The morning of February 24th began normally. John kissed his wife goodbye and left for work. Sherri planned to attend a meeting at the hospital later that day, but decided to stay home a bit longer. Neighbors later reported hearing loud noises, thuds, crashes, something breaking. But in Los Angeles, noise wasn't unusual. No one called the police. When John returned home around 6 p.m., he opened the door and froze. The condo looked ransacked. Shattered glass from the sliding door glittered on the carpet. Furniture was toppled, and the faint smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. He called out for Sherri, but there was no answer. Then he saw her, lying near the living room, her body partially covered by a blanket, a pool of blood beneath her. He ran to her, But it was too late. Sherri had been beaten, bitten, and shot 3 times in the chest. She had fought fiercely. There were signs of struggle everywhere. A vase was shattered, her fingernails were broken, and her arm bore a deep human bite mark. To detectives, it seemed like a burglary gone bad. A few electronics were missing, and the sliding door's glass was broken, possibly from forced entry. But something didn't fit. Sherri's expensive jewelry was untouched. Her purse was still there. The robbers, supposedly desperate enough to kill, had left behind the very things that were worth the most. And that bite mark, intimate, violent, personal, told another story. Still, the case was quickly filed as a botched burglary. The police never tested the bite mark for DNA. They never took a closer look at Stephanie Lazarus, even though Sherri's father insisted they should. He wrote letter after letter to the LAPD, begging them to consider the jealous ex-girlfriend. But he was ignored. The case went cold. As the years passed, life moved on for everyone but the Rasmussen family. Nels and Loretta never stopped pushing for answers. They called detectives, wrote to city officials, even hired private investigators. But the file gathered dust. Meanwhile, Stephanie Lazarus continued her career with the LAPD. She became a respected officer, working in the DRE program, mentoring young recruits, and climbing the ranks. She married another cop, adopted a daughter, and lived what seemed like a normal suburban life. Her colleagues knew her as disciplined and friendly. None of them suspected that behind the smile was a dark secret, one that had been buried under a badge for more than 2 decades. In 2001, the LAPD's cold case unit was established. Detectives began re-examining unsolved murders from the 1980s, using DNA technology that hadn't existed before. When they reopened Sherri Rasmussen's file, one piece of evidence stood out: that old bite mark swab that had been stored, untouched, since 1986. They sent it for DNA testing. And the results changed everything. The DNA from the bite mark belonged to a woman. It was the clue the case had been missing for years. Now detectives began to reread every statement, every note. They saw references to a jealous ex-girlfriend. And one name appeared again and again: Stephanie Lazarus. But this wasn't just any suspect. She was now a senior detective in the LAPD's own ranks. The cold case detectives had to be careful. If Lazarus caught wind that she was under investigation, she could destroy evidence or use her connections to make the case disappear. So they worked quietly, off the record, in a secure part of the building. They traced Lazarus's work history, her duty weapons, and her whereabouts in 1986. Everything pointed back to her. The gun used in Sherri's murder had been a .38 caliber, the same type issued to police officers at the time. Records showed that around that same period, Lazarus had reported her gun stolen. Detectives suspected she had used it in the murder and filed a false report afterward to cover her tracks. Still, they needed solid proof. So in early 2009, they began tailing her. One afternoon, they followed Lazarus to a Costco in Simi Valley. After she finished shopping and threw away a cup and straw from her drink, detectives swooped in. They collected the discarded items and sent them for DNA testing. When the results came back, the match was perfect. Stephanie Lazarus's DNA matched the DNA on the bite mark from Sherri Rasmussen's arm. After 23 years, the truth had finally surfaced. On June 5, 2009, detectives invited Stephanie to come in for what they described as an informal chat about a case in the art theft division. They brought her into an interview room equipped with hidden cameras. At first, she laughed easily, chatting about her job and her years with the department. But when detectives began to shift the conversation, mentioning Sherri Rasmussen's name, everything changed. Her body stiffened. Her voice grew defensive. She said she barely remembered the woman, insisted she'd only known John briefly, and denied having any contact with Sherri. Then came the moment that sealed her fate. When asked if she'd ever been to Sherri's condo, Stephanie hesitated. Too long. Her breathing quickened, her tone sharpened. And in that pause, detectives saw the truth. Minutes later, when they stepped out of the room, she realized what was happening. When they returned, they placed her under arrest for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. The trial began in March 2012. For Sherri's family, It was a mix of pain and relief, the day they'd been waiting for, but one that reopened every old wound. Prosecutors presented a chilling narrative of jealousy and rage. They argued that Stephanie Lazarus, unable to accept John's marriage to Sherri, had used her training, her access, and her gun to eliminate the woman she saw as a rival. The evidence was damning. The DNA match from the bite mark, Sherri's documented fear of Lazarus, the suspicious stolen gun report filed right after the murder, and the clear signs that the burglary had been staged. Witnesses described Sherri as fearful in the days before her death, even telling her father that she felt hunted. Others described Lazarus as emotional and possessive when it came to John. The defense tried to argue contamination and coincidence, that the evidence had been mishandled after so many years, but the jury didn't buy it. After weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. The public was stunned. Headlines called her the killer cop and the detective with a secret. The revelation that a veteran LAPD officer had gotten away with murder for decades shook the department to its core. Many began asking difficult questions. How could a case this personal, with so many red flags, have been dismissed as a burglary? Why had no one listened to the victim's family? And how many other cases had slipped through the cracks because of misplaced trust? For Sherri's parents, the verdict was justice, but not closure. Nels Rasmussen later said, "It took 23 years, but finally the truth came out. That's all we ever wanted, the truth." Even after the conviction, mystery still lingers. Was the murder premeditated? Or did Stephanie go there intending only to confront Sherri? Did anyone else in the department suspect her? And what made her believe she could commit such a brutal act and never be caught? Today, Stephanie Lazarus sits in a California state prison. She continues to maintain her innocence, but the evidence speaks louder than her denial. John Ruetten, the man at the center of this tragic triangle, lives quietly, rarely speaking about the case. He once said that Sherri was the best person he had ever known, and that not a day goes by that he doesn't think of her. Sherri Rasmussen's legacy lives on not only in the memories of those who loved her, but also in the reminder her case leaves behind, that justice can be delayed, but it cannot be buried forever. Because in the end, the truth will always find a way out. And when it does, it speaks for those who no longer can. Sherri Rasmussen was intelligent, kind, and full of promise. She dreamed of a long life with the man she loved, one filled with laughter, family, and healing others through her work. Instead, her life was stolen by someone sworn to protect. But even in death, she triumphed, because her truth refused to die with her. Sometimes, evil hides behind a smile, behind a badge, behind a promise to serve, but no disguise lasts forever. The story of Sherri Rasmussen reminds us that love, jealousy, and betrayal can twist even the most trusted into something unrecognizable. And it reminds us that no matter how deep the lie, justice has patience, and truth, in time, always wins. This is Case Unknown, where cold cases refuse to stay buried. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more haunting mysteries. And don't forget to like the video to support real crime stories that deserve to be heard. Drop your theories in the comments.